Thank you. So, who am I? For the 95% of people that probably don't recognise me, as I hardly ever get to these sessions, I'm a solution architect at Pexify. So I've been developing on Salesforce for probably around 9 years now. And through this convoluted title of my talk, I'm going to talk today a little bit around configuration data and DevOps. So how did this talk come about? Why do I want to talk about this, other than the fact that I'm boring enough to like talking about data? Kind of across a lot of the projects that we've been doing at Pexify, a common theme started to emerge, right? Where we're so focused on our metadata and our DevOps process. So how we set up our branching strategy, PRs, merge process, all of our deployments and releases, how we automate those. And ultimately, we're so focused on getting the perfect DevOps and release process for our metadata. We would come to do a release, and too often it would be someone needs to sit there and load manually 4 or 5 CSV files of data to complete that release, because ultimately that's what the system needed for that data. The system needed that data for it to work. On the flip side of that, it would be quite common that whenever we refresh a sandbox or create a scratch org, there's a set of manual steps that our developers might have to go through, our testers might have to go through to ultimately, oh, you need this data, you need that data from production for that system to behave. So ultimately, what I want to talk about today, and hopefully we'll be in the pub in 35 minutes, is just a little bit around what those challenges are, and then I've got a short demo as well of the kind of tools that we've used to overcome those problems. Excuse me. So I'm aiming to talk for about 15 minutes and then 15-minute demo. Feel free to get up and get a beer if I'm still talking in 20 minutes. Cool, right. So ultimately, taking it up a level, why might we have configuration data? Like, why might we end up with this scenario? Ultimately, as developers, we want to build configurable systems. What do I mean by that? Well, we don't want to hard code every little bit of logic. We don't want to build into our system every single if statement for every little bit of behavior that we've got. We want to make it configurable. And that might be as simple as a checkbox that is somewhere that we can reference in a validation rule to bypass that rule. It might be some configuration that allows us to turn off triggers without having to actually deactivate our triggers. It might be something like some custom metadata that holds the queries that we want to use for our batch jobs. So if we want to change that query, we haven't got to actually change the class to do that. So what kind of tools do we have available to us to build those configurable systems? Well, I think there's many, but we've got kind of 3 obvious ones, right? So we've got custom settings, which of course now hierarchical custom settings. We've got custom metadata, which is kind of replacing our list custom settings, which I'm sure we're all familiar with those two. But the focus of today, what I want to talk about today, is our configuration data and some of the kind of unique challenges we get when we're dealing with this. So what am I actually talking about when I say configuration data? What do I mean by configuration data? Well, I think there's a few characteristics that we can use to define what that is. At the end of the day, sorry, I'm just going to grab my water. It's just data within the system. So if this was a custom solution, it's just custom objects that we're going to create and data we're going to put in that. It's not always custom objects. It could be some managed package objects. It could be some standard objects that we get with the platform. But ultimately, it's just data. What makes it configuration data, I think, is what we do with it. So ultimately, this is data that is going to drive some sort of behavior within the system, some level of automation, whether that's checking a rule so we can throw back some validation to the user, whether that's complex rules engines we've defined in configuration to drive a pricing engine. Ultimately, it's data that drives the behavior of the system. Because it drives behavior of the system, it's going to be administrator-controlled data. It's going to go through that kind of development process. Excuse me. You wouldn't let your users change your metadata in production. So if you've got data that ultimately drives behavior of the system, why would you let your users change your configuration data in production as well? So leading on from that, this data needs to go through a release lifecycle. Someone's got to build it. someone's got to test that it works, and then ultimately we have to deploy that data to another environment as well. It's used by Salesforce, so several Salesforce clouds heavily rely on this kind of configuration data. You might not get a choice, basically, depending on what products you're working with. And I think CPQ is a good example of that. So what I've got here in this blue box, don't worry about what's actually in these tables, but it's just an example of everything. At the end, right? Yeah. Yeah, you will be tested on this. But ultimately, everything within this blue box, this is from a prior project. All of this is configuration data. Adding data to these objects ultimately influenced behavior of the system. So you can see when you've got this many objects, you don't want to manage this in CSVs. You don't want people manually changing this data. You'll never have any trust in your environments. So I think this is a good example of how it can get quite complex quite quickly. And for those that have experience with Salesforce CPQ, this is probably just touching the surface of the objects that come with that package as well. So some people might be thinking at this point, why not use custom metadata types for this? Well, ultimately, for your scenario, custom meta types might be the perfect tool for the job, right? So I'm sure most of us know, but custom metadata types are deployable. Because they're deployable, they're already DevOps friendly, right? We can treat them like any other bit of metadata. We can incorporate them into our DevOps process. And whatever I put next, they're efficient. So ultimately, it's always going to be more efficient to reference custom metadata or even custom settings than query a complex set of data and essentially process that data to drive your behavior. Finally, on the positives, they're obviously more referenceable. So it's much easier to reference custom metadata from things like validation rules than it's ever going to be to reference kind of custom objects or data that you've got within your org. However, they're not the perfect tool for every scenario. We get limited relationships with our custom metadata. So we can obviously have relationships between different custom metadata types. But what if we want to support relationships between our configuration data and other data in the system, like our accounts, like our opportunities, our more transactional data? What if we want to cross that boundary to link that transactional data, like our accounts, to some of our configuration data? What that would allow us to do is then run reports on that kind of data, expose it to our users, let our users build reports as well on our configuration data, something they obviously wouldn't be able to do for custom metadata types. And we can't leverage all of the platform features for custom metadata types as well. What if we want to expose some of this data to our users? We want to support page layouts, field level security. We're not going to let them change it, but we might want to give them some visibility into how the system is configured. Cool. So what are some of the challenges that we can run into when we've got this complex set of configuration data? Well, for me, it's just all the normal DevOps challenges, right? All the normal DevOps challenges we have with metadata, we're going to encounter when we've got this complex set of data that drives behavior of the system. So releases, how do we manage releases? How do we avoid having someone for each release sit there and have to manually data load 4 or 5 CSV files, or however many objects you've got, that's how many CSV files you might have. And that's ultimately going to grow linearly on the effort that takes as well to run that. Equally, how do we avoid manual steps? So there's nothing worse than a manual step to go into this org and check this box on this record to make sure everything is up to date. Visibility and accountability is another one that I want to call out. So if you're developers and you've got a kind of DevOps process, if you change a line of code, you know which line of code you changed. Your source control system tracks exactly who changed it, when they changed it, what branch that got merged in. You've got that visibility and accountability, not to blame people or to throw anyone under the bus, but ultimately it makes it easier to track down what went wrong, where it went wrong, and how we fix it. Versioning. So with our metadata, we know what version we're on. When we deployed, we have the ability to roll back. If we don't manage this data properly, it can become very, very fuzzy as to what was last deployed and when it was last deployed. Trusted environments. This is probably the biggest one for me. So knowing the state of all of your sandboxes, knowing what was last released to it, knowing that the data's not old. But also, if we're following a source-driven development approach, knowing and trusting what is in our repository, what is in our master branch, is actually what is in our production org, or whatever org we might be dealing with. Finally, org setup. I think I touched on this one earlier. So when we refresh a sandbox, when we create a scratch org, how do we make sure that all of the data we need gets added to that org without a series of lengthy manual steps? Cool. So how do we solve these challenges? Coming back to the purpose of this talk, I think we should be looking to treat this data more like metadata, essentially. We should be trying to incorporate this data into our DevOps processes. We should be tracking it in source control. We should be committing it to branches, raising pull requests and code reviews, and ultimately automating our deployments of this data as well. Cool. That was it. So next up is approaches. So what do we have available to us to be able to help us manage this data and incorporate it into our processes? So one that we may have some input in the room from is there's paid tools out there that allow us to manage this data. I know a couple. I won't call out any names in case I make any mistakes. But ultimately, we're not all as lucky that we have a client or an organization that's willing to invest in some of these paid tools. And I know they're very, very powerful, but in my limited experience with those tools as well, as a developer, kind of felt like you had to go all in with those tools for your DevOps processes, where I was kind of looking for something that's maybe a little bit more lightweight and could fit into my existing release management process on that. But happy to be educated after this on the benefits of some of those paid tools. You could build your own. So kind of done this previously, and I'm sure a few other people have as well, where essentially using something like Jitterbit or an ETL tool, we build a custom data migration process that queries certain objects and loads them into an org, stores them in our file system. Ultimately, that's another tool you need to procure if you don't have. It's overhead to build, and on top of that, you then have to maintain it going forward as well. So not something I would like to do if I can avoid it. So what I wanted to show today is a tool that we've been using to basically meet some of these challenges. It's an SFDX plugin called the Data Move utility. So if I stop here, who has used this tool in the room?
Look at us, we are all learning.
So my fear was everyone had used it. And my next question was going to be, has anyone here been involved with building the tool? But I'm guessing that one is probably safe. So this is an SFDX plugin. It's free, and I think it essentially, as a developer, I've found a tool that really meets a lot of those challenges in a way that kind of is lightweight and really easy to integrate into an existing DevOps process. Disclaimer on this, so I'm going to do a quick demo of how we've used this tool and incorporated it into our DevOps process. I didn't build the tool. I'm not affiliated with the tool in any way. I'm not on commission. I just really like the tool.
And I mean, it seems like we don't have that many people who tried it. So from your experience, what are similar tools and what would be the pros and cons if you used 3 or 4 maybe?
Yeah.
Just to give a little bit of understanding of what.
Yeah, so similar tools, well, you've kind of, your options would be, this is essentially a data migration tool, right? So it's all the options you would have when you're migrating your data. So CSVs and data loader yourself, kind of building your own tool for it, using an ETL tool, essentially, to automate that. I know some of those tools, like Prodly, at least, give you the options to migrate data. But in terms of a fully featured plugin or lightweight tool that I'll show you in a moment how easy this is to use. This is the one for me that ticks all of those boxes in a way that is minimal effort to me as a developer. I'll show you in a moment. Cool. Okay. So I've set up a demo on this, but just before I jump into it, I set up a really, really simple scenario. So I've got an ERD here that I've set up in an org, and it's just based on Sales Cloud. So we've got our transactional data over here, our accounts, opportunities, opportunity line items, and then everything within the blue box is essentially my configuration data. Data that I, as an admin, want to control, manage, and deploy. So I've got my products, price books, and price book entries. In my fictional scenario, this is configuration data. It might not be in every single scenario, but in my fictional world, the prices change once a year. Bringing a new product online is quite a delicate process. We want to treat that as configuration of the system. But I think what's probably more interesting and relevant to this is my two custom objects. And I'll show you what they do in a moment. But I've got a country custom object, which allows me to define some configuration about each country within the system, like if it's active, like if we're allowed to sell to it. And linked to that, I've got a discount child object. So this allows me, for each country, to define a product level discount override. Got to remember where I put that. In terms of what I want to walk through, so from a demo perspective, where am I? Where are we at with this? Sorry. So I'm a developer, and I've got this configuration in my dev environment called data dev. Essentially, what I want to do is pull that data back from that environment in a really easy way, add that to my DevOps process, whatever that may be, track it in source control, create a branch, all that kind of stuff. And then I want to push that to data test. So what we're going to do is walk through how we essentially take this data here from the data dev environment to the data test environment. Let me just show you what I was talking about here and hopefully contextualize a little bit what that configuration data actually is and what it means. So if I just open up my data dev org, and I'm going to open up my data test org. So I've got two orgs here. As I said, we can see I'm in my dev environment, and I've got a countries tab that we can see here. So following on from that ERD we just looked at, I've got a series of countries within this org, country record. So every country in the world is here, but I've got a few fields that kind of make this configuration data, right? So I've got an active checkbox against each country, and within this org, when users try to, they create their opportunities, we link the opportunity to the country, and then I've got some validation that runs that says, if this isn't active, throw an error back to the user. I haven't really got that, so I won't show you, but ultimately that's defining why this is configuration data, right, and how we can use this data. Equally, we've got a default discount field, so I've got a custom pricing engine that whenever we sell something on an opportunity to one of these countries, we pull in a default discount. So we've got data here that we wouldn't want to let users manage themselves. We wouldn't want to let them bring countries online, and we wouldn't want to let them impact our pricing engine, right? This is configuration of the system, how we've got these records. However, we want our opportunities and we want our accounts to have references to the countries. We want to let our users run reports on these countries and summarize their opportunities underneath them. So custom metadata types is not a suitable scenario here, and we need to have a custom object. If I click on United Kingdom, we can see that we've got the fields about that, but if I scroll down, we can see here I've got my child table, my product discounts. So I've got two levels here. I've got my United Kingdom country, which has some configuration about that country, and I've set up a series of product by product discount overrides. So my custom pricing engine, when we add a 10 kilowatt product to an opportunity that is linked to the United Kingdom, we pull in a 4% discount. Yes, they are the sample products you get from a new org, and no, I haven't really built that pricing engine, so I'm not going to show that either. But ultimately, in my fictional scenario, this is our configuration data. And right now, as a developer, all I've done is build this out in my org. So however I've got this in my org, I could have handcrafted it, I could have loaded CSVs. Either way, this is a starting point, as in my requirement is essentially build out the active countries within the system and build out that configuration. If I flip over to our data test environment, we can see that, assuming I've set it up correctly, we don't have any of those countries, right? We don't have any of those discounts within the system. So what I want to show is how we can really easily get that data from our dev environment into our kind of release process, source control system, and then back into the test environment as well. So obviously not a full DevOps process, but hopefully give you a flavor of how you might incorporate that into a DevOps process. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to use our SFDX, SFDMU data migration utility plugin. So let's jump to our source control environment. I'm just going to copy this command, and then let's do this here. So ultimately, to use this tool, to use this plugin, you need to give it a command like this. And essentially, to run this plugin, there's three inputs we have to provide. So we have to provide a configuration. Ultimately, how do we tell the tool what data I want it to pull from the org? We looked at that ERD with our countries, product discounts, products, price books. How do we actually tell the tool what data we want to provide or for it to pull? We have to provide a source username, which is going to be obviously my data dev environment, and we have to provide a target username, which in this case is going to be my local file system. But before I do that, I think it's worth just having a look at what that configuration actually looks like. Cool, right. So if I jump to my my projects, I've got over here, for those that saw that command, I've got a data folder, and within that I've created a configuration data folder. So this is just the folders that I've created to essentially manage all my data from a project perspective, from a source control perspective. And what I've got inside that is this export.json file. Now this file is essentially what we're pointing to when we talk about configuration. So I've set one up already, really, really simple, that basically has some basic configuration for just the country objects within that org. So just to talk you through what we're looking at here, within our export file where we define the configuration, I've got a basic exclude the IDs. They're going to change between every org, so why would we ever track any of the IDs for this data? And we then provide it a list of the objects we want to configure for. What does the configuration of an object actually require? Well, it's just a query, right? You have to provide it a query for the object and the fields. And at the moment, I've just set this up for the country object. Operation is upsert. I'm using this to manage my DevOps process. I don't necessarily know what data is already in an org, so I'm upserting so I don't create any duplicates. In terms of external IDs, obviously we have to provide one, especially for an upsert, so we know what we're matching on. But I think one thing that's worth calling out at this point is I haven't actually created any external IDs fields in Salesforce for that. The tool allows you to define anything you want as an external ID, even composite fields, even relationships as well as composite as part of that. If I was really building this in a production system, I probably would add external ID fields, so I'm not tied to this tool and it's a bit more explicit, but ultimately in this case I'm lazy and I don't need to do anything other than just pick a field. So coming back to our command that I'm going to run, we know what our configuration looks like, really simple, just a JSON with a query. My source is going to be my data dev environment, and my target, and that's just my SFDX alias for that environment, and my target is going to be CSV file. So in this case, there's a static value you can provide called CSV file, which essentially makes the target your local file system. So I'm just going to hit enter on that, and what that should do is essentially export all of those countries from the data dev environment and pull them into a CSV file. And we can see here that it's processed 245 records, which is useful. So now if I go to my Git client really quickly, you'll notice I'm one of the few developers that likes a light theme on everything as well. I apologize. We can see that I've got a CSV file in my configuration data folder with all of that country's data in there, right? And at this point, there's literally no difference to if you'd done an export yourself and dropped that CSV file in there. And there's nothing wrong with that either. Where I think the tool becomes really useful and valuable is we need to scale that up now, right? I had 5 different objects that we need to pull data from. How do I avoid having to do 5 different exports to track this data. So you've probably guessed it, but to build this out, what we need to do is essentially increase our configuration in that export file. So I've just copied one that I had earlier, and we'll walk through it, but ultimately this is the full configuration for all of those 5 different objects that I had in my CSV. So I'm querying my products, I'm querying my price books, and I'm querying my price book entries, and I'll just wrap that so we can see that. And you can see here an example of where I'm providing not only a composite external ID that I've defined, but I'm also referencing the relationship fields to do that as well. We've got our countries, and finally, and I haven't changed that in any way, and all of these are just queries with fields, and we've got our discounts. So we've got all 5 objects in here. My discounts are also using a composite external ID, and a feature that I quite like about this tool as well is you can provide an argument that says delete the old data. So when you load, when we run this and we push this to an org, which we'll get onto, this flag here of delete old data will clear out all the product discounts and then reinsert them as well, which can be quite useful because ultimately we've still got to worry about destructive changes here. We've still got to worry about what if a record has been removed, how does it actually get removed from an org. So all I have to do to go back is I've updated my configuration. I'll just check that I saved it. I did. And I'm just running the exact same command. And this is where, from my perspective, I think it's a little bit embarrassing, right? Because I've barely done anything here. Like, the tool is doing like all of the work. And I think because I've had to do so little, it's a really good example of just how useful this tool can be. And just like that, we can see it's exported all of the data, maintaining those relationships between all 5 of those objects. So if I come back to here, and hopefully I'm doing all right for time. I've no idea, to be honest.
We don't
Yeah,
care.
good. Thank you, Trooper. We can see I've now got all 5 of those objects in my version control system. I can commit those CSVs. Again, we're not really going into any sort of like complicated DevOps stuff here or anything like that. This is the first time we've seen that data, and therefore all those CSVs is essentially the equivalent of if we'd exported them. But what we could do is export them in one run really, really easily. One other thing I just wanted to show from that kind of DevOps perspective and how we've started to incorporate this tool into our processes, I'm just going to make some edits to some of this data in here. So I'm going to change the default discount of my United Kingdom country to 2, and then I'm going to change one of the product discounts as well. So if I go to this product discount and let me just change that to something like 5. Cool. So what I really like now is if I rerun and I pull that data, remember I staged those full files. So what I should see when this runs is I should see in my source control system just the rows within that CSV file that have actually changed, right? And if we come back to that visibility and accountability and release management and all that kind of stuff, we can start treating every change to this kind of data just like we would a line of code, right? We can put it through a pull request process, we can put it through code review, and we can see when and where it changed. So that's just running now. Cool. So then if we go and check my source control process, because I've staged those full files, and remember I changed a field on the country and I changed a field on the product discount. Here we go. We can see here that this is now showing me not just which record changed, but the specific field that changed as well. And where I think that becomes really useful is if you've got your configuration file set up and you've got your developers working on changing that data, they don't have to remember what they changed, right? They don't have to remember even which objects they need to pull. They can just run that command, and that's going to pull from the org and flag your changes right there and then. So I think that's really, really useful, and just through that one command, we can incorporate that into our existing processes really easily. So what we need to do now is ultimately pretend I'm putting this through a complicated and well-managed process to get this released, and then push forward to actually the deployment to my data test environment. So how do I get this data into that data test? And we'll just jump back to here, and I'll just remind us that ultimately we don't have any data in data test. So we want to load all those countries and all of those discounts in that as well. So how do I do that? Well, it's the same command, right? There's no real difference between running this for a pull or a push. It's just the source and the target is going to change. So my source username is the CSV file. So I'm pushing from my local machine. This could be your repository, your CI/CD process, wherever you set this up. And my target username is going to be the data test environment. So I'm going to run that because we've got 4,000 discounts in there. I don't think it'll take too long, but I'll try and fill the time. So one other thing I like about this tool is you'll notice I've been talking about the countries and the discounts, but we're also tracking those products, price books and price book entries as well. Now, in my data test environment, I've already got those products. I've already got those price books and those price book entries. They come down by default on a refresh, and we haven't made any changes to those. What I like about the tool is that it does essentially delta deployments on your data. So because I haven't made any changes to the product, price book, or price book entry, it's clever enough to work out it doesn't need to update those records. So when this eventually runs and we see the logs on there, we'll hopefully see that we've only inserted countries, we've only inserted those discounts, and we haven't made any updates, unnecessary record updates to our products, price books, and price book entries. It's quite slow now. I'm going to blame this on the fact that I'm recording, which is using all my CPU. And just to point out that this 22% means my machine is currently being throttled down to 22%, which is quite helpful. So that's running 47 seconds. And if we look here, we can see that we haven't touched our data that hasn't changed. We've only updated or inserted our countries and our product discounts. So if I now go to our test environment, in one run, what we've done there is insert both of those objects. So eventually my machine will refresh this, and we can see that those countries have now been loaded, matching how we expect. And if I click on the United Kingdom, we should be able to see those product discounts in there as well. Here we can see that data has also been loaded. One final thing I just want to show as well, because I think can be really, really useful, is I'm going to go back to my data dev environment, and I'm just going to make a simple change in here, like updating the United Kingdom country to 10. Another feature that I think comes in really useful is it's not just local file system that has to be your target and the source. This also supports org-to-org migrations as well. So if I change my source to data dev, I updated my country discount to 10%. If I run this, in fact, I'm going to cheat because it's going to take some time. I'm going to take my, I'm going to remove my product discounts from my configuration file. I can't complain because this is the exact Mac that I asked for. So. Cool. Right. So hopefully that will save us. Yeah, this will save us a couple of CPU cycles when we eventually run this. But I am now doing exactly what I said I wouldn't do and live demoing of the system. So let's come back here. Let's run again, just to remind us what we're doing here. I updated my United Kingdom country in my dev org, and I'm now doing an org-to-org migration of that country data. So when this is done, which will hopefully be within the next 5 seconds, 50 at most, our United Kingdom country should be updated in that org. Why do I think it's useful for these org-to-org migrations? Well, this is less about our DevOps processes now because we're kind of not able to track this, but more about what if we refresh a sandbox? What if we create a scratch org and we want to pull the latest up-to-date data straight from production or wherever that might be into our org? So we're seeding that org with some really high-quality set of data. I haven't used it, but there is also an anonymization feature that you can use. So if you want to pull like accounts or something like that with PII, looks like you can leverage that tool to do that as well. Cool, so that's run. If I go to my test environment and hit refresh, hopefully, if I didn't delete the wrong bit of configuration, my United Kingdom country is going to now show as 10%. So if this was a client demo, I'd blame Salesforce for being slow, but we know it's actually my machine that's doing this. So there we can see that the default discount has been updated to 10%. So from my perspective, that was kind of all I wanted to show you guys, really. And like I said, I've barely done anything there, right? Like the tool is what is doing all of that work. And I've really just scratched the surface of what that tool can do. So if you've all got loads of questions now, I was hoping some other people had used it so they'd be able to answer on my behalf. But ultimately, yeah, I'll finish up there. And any questions?
Wait, first.
Thank you.
May I ask you to go back for a second?
Oh, we'll try.
Show that.
Back to where?
The one before it. The data model.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Now you can go.
Cool. Any other slides, anyone? Yeah.
You may not know the answer, and it's not strictly configuration data, but I'm going to ask anyway. Do you know if it supports files?
It supports binary data like files and attachments, yes. I haven't used that, but it does, on paper, support them, yeah. Douglas. Been waiting all day for this one.
If I wanted to export and import a subset of the data, does it have any
Yeah.
capabilities?
So I fully expected that question. So I looked up whether it does. And we're talking about, like, if I want to take accounts that begin with A, I only want to take the opportunities that belong to those accounts, right? I couldn't see, I've not used it for that, and I couldn't see any obvious feature that does support that. So we can put that down in the limitations box, I think, unless someone can find that actually that is supported. Yeah.
It is open source, right?
It is open source,
So
yeah.
pull requests.
So you could build it, yeah. Any other
But
questions?
that's something that you can potentially do through the SQL query.
Potentially, potentially, maybe not easily, but yeah, potentially, yeah. It's not. You can put aware on this. You can be selective on your SOCL, but I don't think you could be truly dynamic in terms of only return these IDs from the account. I could be wrong on that. I could be wrong, but yeah, I couldn't see a feature that did that.
I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
Does it support complex external key? I think you showed that in pricebook entry you mentioned product.name and semicolon price.
Yeah, you can define your own composite external ID using, I did look it up, unlimited fields you can define for that. I don't think that's strictly going to be true, but you can try it and see what you get. But it also supports the relationships as well. So you can define, I use the pricebook.name and the product.name to build my external ID for the pricebook entry. So, yeah.
Another question, since if we are deploying data on production, we must have a rollback strategy. In case it gives error, do we have something like that? How will we roll back?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of parts to that. When you deploy data now, what is your rollback strategy? Do you use a tool like a backup tool that you would want to restore from?
But in this tool, does it give that functionality? It's quite fast and impressive.
Yeah, so you could build it to do an export if you wanted beforehand and treat it as your backup. But ultimately, the way I'm using this and the way I've built that, that's what is in your source control. We're basically going source-driven development here. We're trusting what is in source is what we want in that org. In terms of what's actually in your production org, if you can't trust it, then I would recommend a proper backup before you do any releases for that.
I'll rephrase it a bit. If we do a DML operation, we have all or none option, right? In this scenario, let's say we are updating 100 records. If 50 are updated, then it gives an alert.
Yeah, there is an all or none option where it in theory rolls back if it has any errors. Whether that can be fully trusted, I spoke to someone the other day that potentially raised an issue around that. But in theory, that feature is there. In practice, take a backup before you do it. Yeah, would be my recommendation. Chris B.
Can't think of a very good example on this, but we'll just run with it. One thing that we get with metadata that we see all the time that's quite common is environmental differences on the metadata you deploy. I can't think of a good example on the configuration data we might have it, but is that something that you've seen that you know it supports? So if there is config data that you need to load into multiple environments and you know that there's particularly one bit of data that needs to change per environment, is that something you can do? Or is it
Substitution?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it has value mapping features that you can leverage, which again is way beyond my experience with the tool. But ultimately, I think you're building out some automation there, like you would with if you had subfolders for your custom metadata, right? One for QA, one for production, one for test. You might need to look at doing something like that and handling those differences. But in terms of an out-the-box feature that would meet that, maybe, but it's not something I've used.
So is there any limitation on the number of records you can import?
So I would say the limitation is going to be performance on your machine. So a lot of the work that it's doing, and you've seen my machine over here, but I think that's a reflection on my machine more than anything. It does a lot of these mappings internally on your machine when it's mapping records and relationships before it does the upload. I've not used this tool for any true data migrations of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, but I'd be really interested to see what the performance is. It uses bulk API for the actual push, so I don't think there's any true limits on what you can use the tool for. It's just how long would you need to sit there to watch it happen, which can be true for any data migration process as well, right?
Okay.
Probably be your environment type as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Question. So is there any limitation on the files? Because you generated in the CSV format. So is there any other like JSON or something?
As far as I'm aware, it only supports CSV at this point in time.
It's only for CSV.
Only for CSV, I think. Yeah, but it's open source, so you could always build that feature if that's something that's required.
So with that in mind, then you'd have to kind of keep in the back of your head managing dependencies yourself manually, because you can't have that hierarchical structure of JSON.
Yeah, no, it's separate CSV files per object. Yeah, definitely. And that's where the tool, when you do that push, it's doing the internal mapping between those records, in those files, based on those IDs before it does any, to maintain those relationships for the update. Yeah. I didn't hear that one.
60 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Had enough, have we? Yeah. Any other questions?
Have you actually automated it into a deployment process?
So if I come back to that example I had up here of this is a real world example where we used this tool to pull and push all of this data. So developers used it whenever they're making changes to pull that data, put it through that release process or the normal DevOps process, and then we use this tool as well to push all of the data on every release, whether that's sandboxes or production.
Like a pull request was pulled to the next environment in your Git repo?
Yeah, depending on the stage, yeah. So we use Circle CI as our CI tool, and depending on the environment, we kind of would put that command in there and leverage that, yeah. Cool. Time for the pub? Yeah. No, not quite.
I was going to say, have you seen any non-developers using this, and does it exclude a large number of people who are actually making CPQ changes?
Yeah, I haven't seen any non-developers using it. So no, that's absolutely coming back to maybe where those paid tools have those advantages in that you can use your whole DevOps process and they're admin friendly. I would describe this definitely as a developer friendly tool. That being said, I'm sure if they could hear me saying this, they'd all be able to correct me. There is a graphical interface that they've built. I've never used it, but there is a GUI version of this that potentially could be used. But I think that's probably more about building your configuration, whereas here we've already got the configuration. We just need the admins or developers to pull the right data, essentially. If that makes sense.
I think I have a follow-up question to that then. So if, for example, we're trying to deploy a price rule with price conditions and things like that, we're depending on the person who's making the deployment to know those relationships, to know to include them in what they're running.
No, your export file that I showed, that is the export file for everyone, right? No one would, in theory, unless you are making metadata changes where you are adding new fields or creating new objects, that obviously needs to update our configuration. But in theory, as someone who's just making CPQ changes, the objects are there, the fields are there, we've already defined them. Whoever's managing releases, let's say, has defined them. All they have to do is run that pull command. And then the Delta takes care of it, and it pulls the data. And because you're already tracking that CSV in your source control system, that's only going to flag the rows that have changed and the values that have changed. Same then when we push, that's where the Delta comes in, and it's only going to update those records in that org that have actually changed, yeah. Any other questions? I'll defer that one to Keir, yeah. Cool. Time for the pub then. Thank you very much. I'm stopping the recording.